It is a Friday evening in Toronto, sometime in the 1980s. A plane from London has just landed late, and one of the passengers steps out into the cold. He is a tall, soft-spoken man in a black suit and a white shirt, with a full grey beard and an almost shy manner. A car is waiting to drive him home. He waves it away. The sun is about to set, and with it the start of the Jewish Sabbath. And this man will not ride in a car once the Sabbath has begun, so he does the only thing his conscience will allow. He walks for hours in the dark the whole way home. His name is Paul Reichman, and by the height of the 1980s, the company he runs out of Toronto is the largest property development firm on the face of the earth. He owns more office space in Manhattan than the Rockefellers. His towers define the skylines of 3 of the world's great cities. By the measure of money, his family is among the richest on the planet. So how does a man who built the biggest property empire the world had ever seen lose almost all of it? Not over a lifetime, but in a matter of months. This is the story of the Reichmanns, and it begins not with a skyscraper, but with a mother, a war, and a small city on the edge of Africa. Now, before we go back to where it all began, take 1 second to subscribe, because the whole reason this channel exists is to tell stories like the Reichmanns the way they actually deserve to be told. And subscribing is how the next one finds its way to you. 40 years before those towers rose, the Reichmann name meant something completely different, in a world about as far from Wall Street as you can imagine. The family came from Béled, a small town in Hungary. In the late 1920s, Samuel Reichmann moved his wife Renée and their growing family to Vienna, where he made a comfortable fortune in the egg trade. They were devout Orthodox Jews, and for a while, life in Vienna was good. There were 6 children in all, 5 boys and a girl, and the boys' names will matter later: Edward, Louis, Paul, Albert, and Ralph. Then came March of 1938. The family had been preparing to celebrate a son's bar mitzvah in Vienna, but word came that Samuel's father, back in Hungary, had suffered a stroke, and so they traveled to be with him instead. That journey happened to fall on the very day that Nazi Germany annexed Austria, the day history remembers as the Anschluss. In the days that followed, the Nazis began rounding up Jewish community leaders in Vienna. The Reichmanns, by sheer accident of timing, were already gone. It was a coincidence that almost certainly saved their lives. They never went home. Instead, they ran. First to Paris, and then, as the German army pushed across Europe, all the way south to the city of Tangier, on the northern tip of Morocco, where Europe and Africa nearly touch. Tangier in those years was a real-life version of the city in the film Casablanca, a neutral, crowded crossroads full of refugees, spies, and people simply trying to survive. In Tangier, Samuel rebuilt the family's wealth as a currency trader. But the most extraordinary Reichman of the war years was not Samuel. It was Renée. While the Holocaust devoured the Jews of Europe, Renée Reichmann sat in the relative safety of Tangier and refused to look away. Working through the Spanish Red Cross, she organized the shipment of tens of thousands of food parcels to Jews imprisoned in Nazi concentration camps, to Theresienstadt, and even to Auschwitz. She had the parcels labeled as going to prisoners of war, a small bureaucratic trick that gave them a far better chance of actually being delivered. In 1942, she did something almost beyond belief. She traveled back across Nazi-occupied Europe into Hungary to see her elderly parents one last time, relying on a blonde wig and a careful set of forged papers to pass through the checkpoints. It was the last time she would ever see them. And in 1944, when the Jews of Budapest were being deported to their deaths, Renee went further still. She approached the American diplomat in Tangier, a man named J. Reeves Childs, and pressed him, again and again, to help. Through Childs, and through the Spanish High Commissioner, she secured entry visas for hundreds of Jewish children. First a list of 500 names, then another 700. Those papers became a shield. The children were moved into protected safe houses in Budapest, watched over by the Spanish Red Cross. And Renee, who worked alongside the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, did not stop when the war did. She went on helping survivors who poured out of a shattered Europe, some of whom found their way all the way to her own door in Tangier. In all, historians credit Renee Reichman and the people she worked with for helping to save around 1,200 lives. Think about that for a second. Before this family ever poured a single foundation or signed a single lease, their defining act was building a lifeline out of almost nothing, for strangers they would never meet. In the years after the war, Renee's home in Tangier became a gathering place for refugees. She fed them, found them spouses, and hosted dozens of weddings under her own roof. That instinct, to take whatever you have and use it to build something for others, is the thread that runs through everything that comes next. In the mid-1950s, the Reichmanns left Tangier. Morocco was moving toward independence, the old order was dissolving, and Canada, with its large settled Jewish community, offered a fresh start. The eldest brother, Edward, went first, opening a company in Montreal that imported European floor and wall tile. It did well enough that the rest of the family soon followed, most of them settling in Toronto. The work divided naturally among the brothers. Several of them ran the tile business, but two of them, Paul and his brother Albert, the steady administrator to Paul's restless vision, were about to drift into something else entirely. Paul Reichman had never planned to be a tycoon. As a young man, he was a scholar. He studied in religious seminaries in Gateshead, in the north of England, and at the renowned Ponevezh and Mir yeshivas in Israel. In 1953, before he ever set foot in Canada, he became the educational director of a network of Jewish schools across Morocco, crisscrossing the country to build them, dozens in all, including the very first girls' seminary in Tangier. His family fully expected him to spend his life as a teacher or a rabbi. He had been engaged to his wife, Leah, since the age of 15. He did not even join the rest of the family in Canada until 1956. Skyscrapers were nowhere in the picture. What changed everything was, of all things, a warehouse. The family's Toronto Tile Company needed a new building, and the contractor quotes that came back struck Paul as absurdly high. He was certain he could do it cheaper himself. So he bought the land, managed the construction personally, and brought the whole project in for far less than the estimates, saving the company tens of thousands of dollars. Then he sold the building about a year later for a profit of some $34,000. It seemed like a small thing at the time. It wasn't. Because Paul Reichman had just discovered he had a gift, an unusual eye for property, for cost, for the kind of value that other people simply could not see. He and Albert started a development company. They called it Olympia and York. Olympia, after the family's tile business, and York, after the development arm Albert had already begun. At first, they built unglamorous things, warehouses and modest commercial buildings, many of them for North Toronto's growing Jewish community. Over about 15 years, they would put up close to 100 buildings in the Toronto area. Then, in the mid-1960s, Paul made his first real gamble. A large apartment and office complex on Don Mills Road called Flemington Park had stalled halfway up, its original owner crippled by money troubles, and other developers doubted it would ever work. Paul began quietly assembling the land around it. He talked his way into securing a major commercial tenant for an office tower beside the project, and with that single move, he turned a failure everyone else feared into a success. The unknown tile man from Toronto was suddenly a developer worth watching. By the early 1970s, Paul Reichman was ready to stop being a developer worth watching and become one to be reckoned with. His company made an early splash, putting up an office tower for the Toronto Star down at the foot of Yonge Street. But then he set his sights on the single most coveted patch of ground in the entire country, the corner of King and Bay Streets, in the very heart of Toronto's financial district. There was a fierce bidding war for that last undeveloped corner. Olympia and York won it. And the plan was breathtaking for the time, to build the tallest building in Canada, a 72-story tower wrapped in thousands of slabs of brilliant white Carrara marble called First Canadian Place. Then almost immediately, the project nearly died. Toronto's reform-minded mayor, David Crombie, slammed the brakes on large downtown developments, and for 3 years the tower hung in limbo while Reichman lobbied, negotiated, and waited. Most developers would have walked away and cut their losses. He did not. Eventually the project went ahead, and it was a triumph. To this day, First Canadian Place remains the tallest office building in the country, a permanent fixture of the Toronto skyline that millions of people walk past without ever knowing the story behind it. This is where you start to see the man behind the buildings. Paul Reichman obsessed over details that most developers never even considered. To convince skeptical tenants that his white marble tower would look magnificent even in miserable weather, he once poured water over a marble sample, right in front of them, to show exactly how it would gleam in the Toronto rain. And on every single one of his construction sites, no matter how large the project or how tight the deadline, the work stopped cold every Friday at sundown and stayed stopped until Sunday in observance of the Sabbath. He paid his crews overtime for Sunday labor to make up the lost day. He even shut the sites down for the Christian holidays out of respect for the workers who kept them. And he did business the way he lived, on his word. Paul Reichman was famous for sealing enormous deals with nothing more than a handshake, no armies of lawyers, and for always keeping his promises to the letter. In an industry not exactly known for its trust, his word was considered as good as a signed contract. One writer would later describe him as a daring gambler with the gentle manner of a soft-spoken undertaker. That reputation was about to carry him far, far beyond Toronto. So pay attention to this next part, because it explains almost everything that came after. In 1977, New York City was on its knees. The city was nearly bankrupt, crime was high, and confidence had collapsed. Prime office towers in Manhattan were selling for a fraction of their former value, because almost no one believed New York was coming back. Paul Reichman believed. While everyone else ran for the exits, he made one of the boldest bets in the history of real estate. He bought a package of 8 Manhattan office buildings, a group known as the URIS portfolio, for around $325 million. People thought he had lost his mind, but Reichman had read the city correctly. Within just a few years, as New York recovered, those same 8 buildings were worth roughly $3.5 billion. In a single move, he had turned his family into a major power in the largest real estate market on Earth. He was not finished. In 1980, beating out 10 rival developers, Olympia and York won the rights to build on a 13-acre stretch of landfill at the southern tip of Manhattan, right beside the World Trade Center. There, Reichman hired the celebrated architect Cesar Pelli and built the World Financial Center, a $1.5 billion complex of 6 towers, soaring glass atriums and waterfront plazas with more than 7 million square feet of space in all, drawing blue-chip tenants like American Express and Merrill Lynch. One New York Times critic called it the finest group of skyscrapers since Rockefeller Center. By 1990, the scale of it had become almost hard to believe. Olympia and York owned around 40 major office towers across a dozen cities on both sides of the Atlantic. The family held roughly 8% of all the commercial office space in New York City, more than twice as much as their closest rival, the Rockefellers. In 1991, Forbes magazine ranked the Reichmanns as the fourth richest family in the world, worth nearly $13 billion. They had even pushed beyond real estate, buying control of the energy giant Gulf Canada in 1986 for around $3.5 billion, at the time the largest private transaction in Canadian history, along with major stakes in other Canadian corporate giants. And running underneath all of it was a single philosophy: that each new project should be even bigger than the last, and that if you simply trusted your own judgment, the returns would always come. So far, it had never failed him. And yet, if you had passed Paul Reichman on the street, you would never have guessed any of it. He flew economy class, he drove an old Cadillac. He lived in the same comfortable but ordinary Toronto home he had owned for years. His one personal indulgence, it was said, was collecting rare and ancient Jewish books. The family gave away as much as $50 million every year to schools, synagogues, and hospitals around the world. The empire was vast beyond imagining, but the man at the center of it had barely changed at all. If you have made it this far, you are clearly someone who cares about the kind of history most people walk right past. If you are enjoying this story, take a moment to subscribe. It genuinely helps these forgotten stories find the people who would love them most. By the late 1980s, Paul Reichman stood at the absolute height of his powers, and if he had simply stopped right there, this would be a very different story, the story of perhaps the greatest real estate dynasty the world has ever known. But he did not stop. There was one more bet to make, the biggest of his life. And it was waiting for him across the ocean, in the mud of East London. For centuries, the docklands of East London had been the beating heart of the British Empire's trade. But by the 1980s, the docks were dead. Acres of derelict, abandoned land on a bend in the Thames called the Isle of Dogs. To almost everyone, it was a wasteland. To Paul Reichman, it looked like the opportunity of a lifetime. And the very same instinct that had made him rich, seeing value where everyone else saw ruin, was about to lead him over a cliff. In 1987, the bulldozers moved in, and Olympia and York took on the development of a 71-acre site on the Isle of Dogs called Canary Wharf, paying somewhere around $1 billion for the land. The vision was staggering. An entire second financial district for London, a rival to the historic square mile of the old city, crowned by a tower called One Canada Square that would, for a time, be the tallest building in Britain. It would be the single largest commercial property development on the planet. And there is a reason people still talk about what happened next. The whole plan rested on a handful of assumptions, and one by one, they failed. Reichman was confident that London's banks and law firms would leap at the chance to move into shining new towers. They did not. The City of London was bound by centuries of tradition, and firms were deeply reluctant to relocate to what still felt like the far edge of nowhere. The project also depended on transport, and the key link was an extension of the London Underground's Jubilee line that was meant to connect Canary Wharf to the rest of the city. Reichman believed the government would build it. By some accounts, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher had personally encouraged him to take the project on in the first place. But the railway was delayed again and again. It would not open until the year 2000, long after it could have saved him. Then the timing turned cruel. Britain slid into a deep recession. Property values fell across the board, and the beautiful new towers of Canary Wharf sat largely empty, swallowing money and producing almost none. Here is where the engine of the entire empire revealed its fatal weakness. Reichman had built much of his fortune on borrowed money, financing enormous, slow-moving construction projects with short-term debt that had to be repaid and renewed over and over again. A new tower could take years to finish and earn nothing in the meantime, so the loans on it were constantly rolled over, often by borrowing against the rising value of buildings he already owned. As long as everyone believed in him, the banks kept lending, the values kept climbing, and the machine kept running. The Reichmanns were intensely private about their finances. Even major lenders were shown only partial glimpses of the company's books. Paul's reputation alone was enough to open the vault, and some bankers, it was said, were reduced to memorizing financial figures during brief meetings because they were not allowed to take the documents away. But when Canary Wharf began to bleed, and the value of property everywhere was sinking at the same moment, that confidence finally began to crack. And a machine that runs on confidence does not slow down gently when the confidence runs out. It seizes. By 1991, Canary Wharf was paralyzed for lack of financing, and the trouble was spreading through the whole empire. Other Reichmann properties were drowning in debt, and the family's other great bets were unraveling at the very same moment. The Gulf Canada stake, a large holding in the financial firm Royal Trust Co., and more. When real estate and the stock market fell together, there was nowhere left to turn. Everything Paul Reichman had built was now turning against him. The sheer size of it, the borrowing, the interlocking loans that had once made expansion feel effortless, now made the collapse impossible to stop. In March of 1992, Paul Reichman was forced to resign as president of the company he had built from a single warehouse. In May, Olympia York filed for bankruptcy protection. And when the full picture finally emerged in court, the numbers were staggering. The company owed somewhere in the region of $20 billion to banks and investors all over the world. The collapse marked the humbling of what had only recently been the world's most admired real estate empire, and it sent a shockwave through the global financial system. Bank stocks fell, the Canadian dollar itself wavered. Dozens of the world's largest banks discovered almost in the same instant just how exposed they were and how little they had truly understood about the private empire they had been so eager to fund. There would be no rescue. The relationships were too strained, the debts too vast. In 1993, Olympia York was broken apart, its great towers carved up among the banks, which were forced to swallow billions of dollars in losses. Many of those celebrated New York buildings would eventually pass into entirely different hands. Only a year earlier, the Reichmanns had sat near the very top of the world's billionaire rankings. Now, they simply vanished from the list. The largest property empire the world had ever seen was gone. It had taken Paul Reichman roughly 30 years to build it. It came apart in about 30 months. For most people, a fall like that would be the end of the story. For Paul Reichman, it was something closer to a beginning. He did not hide, and he did not quit. Within a few years, he was back in the arena. He quietly built a second, smaller fortune in a business few would have expected: retirement and nursing homes across Canada and the United States. And he never stopped looking for the next undervalued opportunity. Then, in 1995, in an astonishing turn, he helped lead an investment group, one that included the financier George Soros, that bought back control of Canary Wharf itself, the very project that had ruined him. He pushed ahead with the development he had always believed in. And slowly, the place began to fill. Today, Canary Wharf is exactly what he imagined it would be: a second financial heart of London, home to tens of thousands of workers. The vision had been right all along. The timing had simply been wrong. In 2005, an alliance of developers led by Morgan Stanley bought Canary Wharf, and Reichman finally stepped back from the project that had defined the second half of his life. But he could not sit still for long. At the age of 75, he announced plans to raise a new multi-billion-dollar property fund, telling reporters he was bored with retirement. By 2011, the family fortune had quietly climbed back to well over $1 billion. But the most telling thing about Paul Reichman is not that he rebuilt. It is what never changed. After losing one of the great fortunes on earth, he went on living almost exactly as he had before. The same modest home, the same quiet faith, the same giving. The schools and the synagogues never stopped. And he was honest about what had gone wrong. Years later, reflecting on the disaster, he did not blame the banks, or the recession, or the railway that never came. He blamed himself in one unforgettable line. "The fact that I had never been wrong," he said, "created character flaws that caused me to make mistakes." There is a deeper truth folded inside that humility. Late in his life, Paul Reichman was asked about everything he had accomplished. And he said that the achievement he was proudest of was not the World Financial Center, not First Canadian Place, not even Canary Wharf. It was the schools he had built for children in Morocco, decades earlier, when he was just a young teacher with no money and no fame at all. The towers, for all their glass and height, were only towers. Paul Reichman died in Toronto on the 25th of October 2013 at the age of 83. But the story does not end where the money does, because the thing this family was really building was never the kind of thing a bank could carry off. Think back to that man at the very start, walking home through the dark Toronto streets, turning his back on a waiting car because the sun had set. Everything that actually made him who he was, his faith, his family, his word, and the lifeline his mother once built out of a city on the edge of Africa, none of it ever showed up on a balance sheet, and none of it could be repossessed. And in 2019, his descendants quietly gave $5 million to build a Holocaust memorial in Tangier, in the very city where René Reichman once mailed hope into the camps, the surest sign that the real inheritance had survived every crash and was still being handed down. Which leaves a question worth turning over. If a family can lose the single largest property empire on Earth and still keep the only things that ever mattered to them, then maybe those towers were never really the empire at all, and maybe that's true of a lot more families than just this one. If yours carries a story like it, of landing somewhere with nothing and quietly building something the money could never measure, drop it in the comments, because people genuinely read them, and those are the stories this channel exists for. And if the Reichmanns pulled you in, the family already coming up on your screen will too. Another set of immigrants who arrived on the wrong side of the world with empty hands and built something that reshaped an entire city before most people ever learned their name. That story's just beginning. Keep watching.